Namaskar and good morning. Honorable Minister Narendra Singh Tomar ji, it's a great pleasure to have you here. I think that your presence gives us a sense of the importance of Panchayati Raj in this government's vision and in your own commitment. If you allow me, I want to take a little bit of a historical perspective on local governments. And the reason I want to do that is local government is not a project. It's not a water and scheme. It is not a self-help group scheme. Local government is the creation of a third tier of government which is closer to the citizens. It's a very different, if you will, framework than one of, if we were discussing today, rural development projects, or if we were discussing today an education project. So to understand a little bit how do nations actually see the emergence of a third tier of government, I think we have to do a little bit of introspection in terms of history. And if we look at history, especially of the post-colonial era in South Asia and Africa, two regions that I've worked on quite a bit. What's interesting is when colonialism ends, what emerges is the nation state. And colonialism was really an aspiration for nationhood. So the first, if you will, revolution of state formation is a national state formation in which national aspirations were created. What's interesting is in today's world, the issue is no longer nationalism or identity of the nation, it's one of citizenship. Many ways, the emergence of free countries after colonialism was not about citizenship. It was about being a national, right? Having a free India, having a free Bangladesh, where I come from. But today, the challenge facing governments is how do you promote citizenship? And one of the lessons we have learned around the world, for citizenship to work, citizenship demands accountability of the state. And if the accountability of the state is to happen, the state must be brought closer to the people. So the movement towards decentralization today is a natural offshoot of the revolutions that come which created the nation state. So that's, I think, one of the first lessons of history. But what's interesting, and this is the second lesson of history, is nations coming out of colonialism see the nation being built top-down. But many of the nations of the West see their nations being built bottom-up. So I'll take the example of the United States. United States, you saw the arrival of the Mayflower communities coming in, the pilgrims that came in. They formed local governments formed state governments, and state governments came together to form the federal government. What's interesting is when the bottom forms the center, the bottom is strong. But when the center forms the local, not easy. The center doesn't always want to give up the power to the local. So the creation of Panchayati Raj and strengthening of Panchayati Raj, coming back to my first point, cannot be seen as just simply a creation of a project. It is a political economy story of how the center and the state must give up powers to a tier of government which is closer to the citizens, if citizenship and accountability is to truly matter. And what is interesting, and this is the third lesson of history, is if you look at, broadly speaking, and if you take a look at where development truly has happened with accountability, local governments have been strengthened. So strengthening local governments strengthens service delivery to citizens. This is a relationship that you can do as many research you want, and different methodologies can be done, and you can debate about it. But if you take a historical perspective on it, there is very little doubt of the relationship between accountable local government and delivery of services such as water, sanitation, education, health. So the stakes for a country is not only about accountability, it is about service delivery. It's interesting if you take a look at its history of India, and I must ask permissions of all the citizens of India to allow a Bangladeshi to reflect on the history of Indian local government, but let me try. My read of this history is interesting from the perspective that if you look at the 1857 mutiny in the colonial British era, the British felt that they could hold on to this part of our world through fiscal decentralization. So local government becomes important to them as a way of holding on to the country by saying, we'll bring the state closer to people. And in 1870, under Lord Mayo, you get the first Fiscal and Administration Local Government Act, which led to the Bengal Village Chowkidari Act. Very interesting political move by the British. And of course, 1882 is the Lord Ripon Local Government Act itself. But when freedom comes to our part of the world, nationalism is extremely important. The Constitution of India, and indeed the Constitution of most of the countries that emerge in South Asia, really don't strengthen the third tier of government. It strengthens only two tiers. And in fact, my read is that Article 40 of the Constitution emerges as an entry point into strengthening or creating local governments, but there was no direct measure of creating panchayats. And coming out of Article 40, you have in the initial government, Minister of Community Development. That was S.K. Day. And really, panchayat story emerges out of, ironically, community development. But again, the notion of the linkage between accountability, communities, and local government. And it wasn't until, I think, if I have the dates right, it wasn't until 1960 or 1959 that Prime Minister Nehru inaugurates the first PRI, right? Now, that took a long time. And then throughout the years, you have different state governments promoting local government. And I think your history will give due to people like Ramkrishna Hedge, to Jyoti Basu, West Bengal, Karnataka, and others in wanting to strengthen panchayats. And then, of course, the constitutional amendment emerges. But with the emergence of constitutional amendment begins, I think, a very important story of how to strengthen local governments. And the first story of India, which is the vast story of India, is democracy. Nowhere in the world are more local government leaders elected than India. And nowhere in the world are more women elected in panchayats than India. And that's a huge victory of democracy of India. And I think that was the first movement towards strengthening the panchayats. But what lagged was the fiscal and the administrative powers into that political democracy. And I think you are in this ministry, and through programs through this ministry are at that center of that political economy of how can one bring fiscal and administrative power to match the democratic shifts that India has introduced. And I think the battle is still a battle between centrally sponsored schemes. Are they top-down or are they related through panchayats? State governments themselves willing to give power, and therefore the role of finance commissions at the center and finance commissions at the state. And third, which is what brings us to today's session, is direct programs to strengthen local governments. And the direct programs to strengthen local governments, what we think are some very simple principles which this session or this workshop has to look at. And that set of principles are the following: that if you want to strengthen local government, give money directly to local government, which is unconditional. Meaning, don't say you must use it for A, B, and C. Give it to local governments and hold them accountable for using it. So the whole design of how money flows is extremely important. Second, along with that money flow, you have to figure out a way to provide capacity. But what we have learned is unless you give responsibility, capacity doesn't grow. If you begin with capacity from the top, it becomes supply-driven, not demand-driven. And then the third part, which is extremely important, is as you bring money and capacity, how do you link local governments to Gram Sabhas? How do you get the citizens to be involved in the way that local government will function? Somehow, the programs that we have to put together in partnership, and I think that the 4 states, the programs that are there, you will judge, the challenge is to link the fiscal transfer with the capacity and citizens' involvement. How do you link the 3 together? And there is an assumption that if you create performance grants, you can actually make that linkage happen, bottom up. That's the challenge of the design. But the challenge of the design, again, I have to say, and I would ask you all to remember, is not a technocratic design. That design is a reflection of a nation's political economy commitment to creating local governance and a 3rd tier of government. Today, most of the federal systems in the world have a 3rd tier. So you're talking about Brazil, you're talking about South Africa, you're talking about Indonesia, and you're even talking about China. What's interesting is India belongs to more the US, Nigeria, and there is India, where none of these federal systems actually recognized a 3rd tier until late in their history. And in fact, India is the only one that has a constitutional amendment for 3rd tier. United States does not have one. And yet, the 3rd tier United States is very strong. So there's a history here to learn what allows the emergence of a 3rd tier even without a constitutional push. Nigeria has not done anything on the 3rd tier that really can push it. India has. So a lot of eyes in the world are on India. How will India really see the rise of its 3rd tier? And I think that's the challenge of this workshop in the design. Let me conclude by saying that when we first started working with Government of India on these 4 states, there was another country, another state, I would not say, but another country that joined this 4. That was mine, Bangladesh. In fact, the program that we supported in India starts off in Bangladesh, then it started in Karnataka, then it was West Bengal, then Kerala. So there are 4 very important local government programs that have been going on for now a decade and a lot of lessons to learn. So I hope, Tomarji, that one day you will invite the Minister of Local Government from Bangladesh to come and join you and to share the lessons that they're learning. But I think it is not an accident that in South Asia you have Bangladesh and India moving into local government space in a strong way, both because of its history, both because of its commitment to democracy, and finally, both in its commitment to ensuring service delivery for its citizens.